Bahri Alptekin, considered one of the more important senior figures of the art scene in Istanbul. Very active, particularly in the 90s and the early 2000s up until his death. But really very much that generation in Turkey that were firstly active internationally. Definitely one of the most significant artists of his generation who's underappreciated. So we wanted to do a retrospective of his work that would bring much more visibility to his practice, particularly as one of the first people to look at questions of globalization, the movement of people and objects that was happening at that time. Really somebody who was observing this in the everyday and trying to, in his own artistic way, figure out really what that meant. The title somehow seemed to really summarize a fundamental characteristic of his work. These two words, democratic and luxury, do not necessarily work in a compatible way, because of course luxury is not necessarily meant to be democratic, but I think it was his way of talking about capitalism, particularly to look at this sort of strange balance between what he described as the vulgar and the beauty, and the relationship between these two things. And I think this is something that's very much characteristic in his work, particularly with things like the hotel sign sculptures.
He was a man full of obsessions. This work actually became a kind of an icon, like like photographing the signs with the name of the cities. And after that, it developed into the actual hotel signs with the city names, which I think it's a very interesting development, physically.
They offer the promise of the experience of a faraway, exotic place, but in reality, what you would have got in one of these hotels is really like the most basic, cheap hotel that you could imagine. The truck was made in '95, so exactly 20 years ago for the Istanbul Biennial. It's a collaboration between Alptekin and Michael Morris. All of their work started with some sort of road trip. That's what Michael was explaining to me, and this work was very sort of typical of that, where they go on a journey with something from one part of Turkey and end up eventually where they want to be, and they deliberately overpiled it with these balls to make the whole thing look slightly absurd and even a bit like a toy, actually.
It's a very playful work. He was already playing with the words, there are those sentences that the truck drivers they put on the back of the truck, kind of protection. And one of that in Turkish is "Life ends, road never."